Dr. Ragland focuses specifically on how our society conceives justice as retributive and proposes a shift towards restorative justice to transform communities and criminal justice system and take America's turbulent history and lived experience into account for policies at all levels. Please join me in warmly and passionately welcoming Dr. David Ragland.
I've never been in any way called or referred to as a prophet, but that's dope. That's hella dope. So I don't even think I have to turn up the heat because it's already hot. And I just want to begin by thanking David and colleagues here, Dr. Mary Watkins, Susan James, Lizzie Rodriguez, and all the amazing students that I've come in contact with here, as well as all of you who are gathered here to do this important work and have these important discussions in this time. And speaking of these times, how many people have heard of Reverend Sekou? Right? A few people have heard of him, but he's a Ferguson protester, and he spent a lot of time out here in California. And like James Baldwin said many times ago, he's also recently said, we are living in a time of moral monsters. I agree and I disagree. I think about Hannah Arendt, one of the most important political philosophers of our age, who, when she was covering the trial of the Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann for the New Yorker, she described Eichmann as somebody who could be your neighbor. He was ordinary. When asked about his work making the trains go faster to deliver Jews to their death, he said, I was doing my job. For this, he was trying to remove himself from responsibility. But this absence of responsibility, this focus on doing our job or even improving our position or rising up in the hierarchy, sometimes that focus, and in particular in Nazi Germany, that focus was what Arendt called the banality of evil. She said that people informed on each other, people allowed such atrocity and participated in such atrocity because they had no moral compass. They lacked the moral resources. At the same time, that's still evil. And recently I had a friend whose parents had escaped Germany before the final solution, before everything sort of came to a head. And what he told me was that after this last election, he felt the same angst of hearing those stories from his parents. And with that, I think we are living in times where unimaginable evil is continuously perpetrated daily. But this evil is, in a way, hidden and open. Because like we see the deportations, we see the lynchings of black folks by police. We live on stolen land. So we've, to some extent, been insulated because it's not in our faces. And this is a kind of American forgetfulness. I think it's an American forgetfulness that purifies white folks in this society, that disconnects them from their privilege to the suffering of others. But it also, as a system, as a capitalistic system, that triple evil that King described as materialism, that extreme materialism, that care only for the material, that anything goes in the face of profit. We become complicit in the clothes that we wear, and as we drive down the road using oil and gas from wars that pillage entire communities and countries. And so I believe that as the number of lynchings of black and brown people by police continue to soar, and the majority in this society are not troubled by the vast militarization that supports a certain kind of order and wealth of a few, we should all be engaged to deal with the moral monsters our complicity and fellow citizens have helped to unleash upon us. So, that's sort of like what I've been thinking about lately, and it's not so clear because I'm coming from different places and talking to different people. But I want to focus my talk today with this notion of moral monsters as a backdrop. But I'm going to focus on 3 points. And they are the importance of stories to remind us of our human connections, our role in activism as listening and following the leadership of the most impacted folks by the evils of our time, and the strategic importance of truth from the margins to guide our solidarity, funding, and participation in movements. So I'm just going to tell some stories as I talk, and it'll become clear, hopefully. But I'm going to start with thinking about sort of my point of departure, which is from Ferguson. And I grew up there, but let me just start by kind of sharing with you that what we saw happening beginning on August the 9th was not the beginning. And Ta-Nehisi Coates, Jamala Rogers, Richard Rothstein, all writers about our history, have described in the ways of black folks migrating or escaping from the terrorism of the Jim Crow South between 1916 and 1970. And how we encountered the structural racism of housing covenants, redlining, predatory financial policies, and brutal policing to halt the movement toward decent housing, education, schooling, employment in suburban communities like Ferguson. Predatory policing, reinforcing this de facto segregation, was part of the calculus that sparked what you all saw in the news in Ferguson. That was the humiliating response to the or the response to the humiliating murder of so many of our young folks, but in particular Mike Brown Jr. And then, I think the protest began this kind of radical truth-telling that's been rampant in so many different movements. But personally, my story is that, as David mentioned, and as I've shared with many people in this room before, I grew up in North St. Louis, and I'm writing a book right now, and in the first chapter, I describe growing up in North St. Louis, just a couple miles from Ferguson, and how my first experience with the police was my uncle being stopped by the police. I was about 6 years old, and he had just come home from Korea, and he was in the Air Force. And my fear was a response to his fear. Now, we made it out of that encounter, but many, many more experiences like that, and going through Ferguson, which St. Louis tried to, in a sense, disconnect from the city. But Ferguson is part of St. Louis. And so on August the 9th, I was in St. Louis because August the 9th is my mother's birthday, and it's also my nephew's birthday. And so I remember talking about this course I was teaching with a friend I had reached out to. I was at home, and we were talking, and he was like, it just happened. Another one killed. Because I was telling him about Gaza, and we had just taken my students to observe a protest and a counter-protest in front of the Israeli embassy in D.C. And he said, we have our own Gaza right here. So we went to the protest immediately, and I remember being an academic in that space and not necessarily knowing how to pull my mind out of that. So I started off observing, taking interviews, tell me you're, doing that whole thing. And then Kajimi Powell was killed across the street from my parents' house. I don't know if people saw that video. I'm not going to show it, but Kajimi Powell is about 2 weeks after Mike Brown was killed. And he goes into this corner grocery store in North St. Louis, and he takes 2 big cans of these energy drinks, and he takes them. And he walks out to the curb and puts them on the ground. And then he had a serrated knife. He's pacing back and forth. Now, I know this because I know the person who called the police. She's a public official in St. Louis. And what she said to the police is, look, this boy has a knife. I know his people. He has some issues, some disturbances. But since Mike Brown got killed, he's been exacerbated walking around the neighborhood. Within 10 seconds of the police arriving, he was dead. You can count it. The police pull up, the car door opens, and we've seen it many, many times on television. And for me, across the street from my parents' house, it got more real. And so we were trying to figure out, how do we respond, or how do I respond personally? Like my background had been a part of peace movements, as part of the anti-war movement. When we first went to Iraq and Afghanistan, I was a peace educator in graduate school, and in my class, engaging students in the work. And I think the prompt was, I was actually standing in front of my house And one of my colleagues called and said, "What are you doing?" And so some of the people I'd been protesting with, we got together and we started talking about what we should do. And this was, early August, maybe like 3 weeks after Mike Brown got killed. And, we didn't want to start like some kind of protest organization because there was already protests happening that we wanted to value and support. And, not try to do something as academics usurping what other folks were already doing. And so we thought that we knew a lot of folks had come in to St. Louis who were not from St. Louis, and it's important for other folks who have concerns to come in and other organizations to come in. But they came in and they sort of laid this infrastructure, but we decided that we wanted to create this space so that people can hear what folks have to say in sort of a different realm. That was some of the initial ideas, like this space for dialogue, this space for conversation. So for cooperative learning. But we also saw whatever we do should be supporting the youth protests. So, over time, we're having conversations with all kinds of people from across the country. And since my background is in restorative justice and transitional justice and peace and conflict studies, it came natural to think about the notion of restorative justice or even truth and reconciliation in this political moment, potentially as an educational intervention. But even that was fraught with problems. Because, we had connected with folks from the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We connected with folks on the international realm. I don't know if people have heard of International Center for Transitional Justice. So many people just started talking to us and freely sharing their perspectives. And we even had an attorney who was a part of the residential school Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada come down and speak with us. And so after listening to all of those folks and even having a national convening where experts came from all around the country and activists and people from the local community were there, we had problems with the structure of Truth and Reconciliation as it was shared with us, as we understood it and was understood by people within the community. So in the early days when we first said we're going to have this truth-telling thing, the Department of Justice contacted us. And one of the protesters reminded me saying, you know what one of the main chants are, right? I don't know if you heard this. It says indict, convict, send those killer cops to jail. And the last part says, because the whole damn system is guilty as hell. So what does that mean in the context of Truth and Reconciliation, which is understood as often this process that's state-sponsored? The state has an interest there. Maybe harmony and reconciliation among people is like an afterthought, but the primary interest is after a long conflict, states have an interest in maintaining the state, maintaining power and control. And so we started to think about and envision something for our community. And this speaks to the role of activists, of all of you in this room. What do communities want? What do communities need? Who's already there doing it? And so I remember even during the October rising or uprising, a lot of folks came into St. Louis that October, and we had this huge convening, and one of the conversations was, what about truth and reconciliation? And somebody was like, fuck reconciliation. We could deal with some truth right now. And that was a sentiment that was strong and it was important. And it doesn't mean that people didn't want to be reconciled. But I think in part, the way reconciliation can be understood or has been understood as blanket forgiveness. Now, we know that this may not be completely true, but there is truth in the liberal conception of it. Because I don't know how many times folks have told me, well, if you just forgive. I can forgive personally, but I don't have the right to forgive for others. Isn't that taking agency away from people? Or what about the right to be angry? Right? So I had encountered and worked with some students from New York City who were engaged in restorative justice, which, as Fania Davis describes, should be the core of any truth and reconciliation process. And these students, their classmate, Kamani Gray, was killed by the NYPD a year prior to this encounter. And we were having these conversations, and it was asked if we should invite the police officer or even a proxy who had killed their student, right? Putting people in front of each other. Right? This can be important. It can be empowering. But one of their responses was, every time I hear about a black or brown person being killed, I get re-triggered. It happens all over for me again, right? Speaking of trauma, right? Speaking of those stories that they remember from their parents, like, the story of my uncle being beat at the same place where Kajimi Powell was killed over a jar of jelly. They didn't find the jar of jelly. I mean, I'm thinking it would be obvious that he had a jar of jelly on him. Beat in the head, bleeding. And so the question was, how do we envision something that honors the notion of truth and reconciliation, the long work necessary to get there, but still honor what people wanted? So we decided to focus primarily on truth-telling. And one of the lines that comes to mind when we think about truth-telling is what Alice Walker describes in her poem, Democratic Womanism. And she says in that poem that the past must be examined thoroughly before we can let it go. Truth-telling. So we came up with a process where people were, not just people tell their stories, but ensconced in ritual and healing and resources for folks to have conversations and work through some of their issues. Because we didn't necessarily want to romanticize the notion of truth and reconciliation, because, like you see the images of Mandela, but you don't see the student movement now who are questioning what happened multiple decades ago. Or we don't see the non-prosecutions from the many truth commissions, or the lack of power that these commissions have had, or even the difficulty in establishing what's next for Greensboro. But we came up with a set of goals to essentially empower our own community, create our own narratives, offer this alternative vision of justice rooted in stories. And immediately after returning from Greensboro, they essentially helped us to come up with this, with our mandate. And we had this launch of a truth initiative, and this video is one of the last hearings that we had in a series of hearings where people came and told their stories about their family members who had been brutalized or killed by police, and even people who had been themselves targeted and brutalized. So some of the critiques suggest that just the telling of those stories can be traumatizing or re-traumatizing. And they can. Which is why we were very intentional about setting up a way that people's stories could be validated, heard by folks there, shared with other people, but not sort of in this, echo chamber. And I remember, like, after the first hearing, Fania Davis came, and we were standing and talking, and she said to me, the way that you all did this, these stories were, for me, healing and empowering. I can't imagine what the other people were there, but just imagine being there and people are validating your story. But also without being targeted by police who were there. So, I want to speak to some of the evidence from, like, did we actually accomplish anything? And so, I believe we're still in the beginning, and I just came from Oakland, and where there's a number of folks, we gathered to have a deep dig around the possibility of a national truth and reconciliation process. And one of the things that I was suggesting was that we essentially, I believe, need a decade of truth-telling. America still isn't listening. But yet, the stories hold something really important, which I'll get to, that is connected to the strategic importance of stories. So, many of the folks who told their stories, I believe, gained confidence, because one of the things we were interested in was increasing or building political efficacy. We had over 10 Ferguson protesters who were involved in the truth-telling process run for office. Now, I can't necessarily take credit for that, but we know this is part of what empowers people to continue forward and actually make changes in their own life, whether or not you believe in the political process as is, but to engage in that way. And I pulled up a video because one of the protesters, Christine Hendricks, who was recently elected to the University City School Board, which is a small municipality right next to Ferguson, she had been tased by the police and intimidated, and they tried to prevent her from essentially telling her own story, and she ran for office, won, and is now suing the police. This is important because we have to know what people are going through. And I'm not gonna play this, but this is Christine, and she's a part of our project, and a mother and a person who's developing community-led farming initiatives. But also, Pastor Cori Bush, who's also a part of the True Telling Project, ran for the U.S. Senate, and people were telling her, what right does a black woman from St. Louis have to run for the U.S. Senate? She didn't win, but came out with almost 40% of the vote in the Democratic primary statewide. Because people saw this woman who was a nurse supporting, a divorced nurse supporting 2 kids as somebody whose experience that they could connect to. And now she's running for, or she's actually Bernie Sanders' first candidate for the U.S. Congress in the brand new Congress that he's working on. But in addition, we've continued to do healing circles and solidarity work. When I leave here, I'm going to go to Gallup, New Mexico, because we've connected and doing solidarity work with Navajo activists who are already doing this work. But we're going to just talk and share our experience, not as experts. And then recently, I was contacted by the folks in St. Louis who were working on the consent decree. How many people have heard about the consent decrees after people were killed by police? Right, so Baltimore had one, I think the Department of, Los Angeles. Now, what people, I don't know if people know this, Jeff Sessions recently advised cities that they didn't have to comply with these consent decrees to actually investigate and deal with the racism and violence in their police department.
What are they?
So a consent decree is essentially an order to deal with your shit. So, and I'm saying this because we got the call from the committees working on this in St. Louis and for Ferguson, because in St. Louis, what Jeff Sessions said doesn't matter because we had a ruling in the lower court that is saying that ours has to be enforced. And so as a beautiful testimony to the truth telling and the impact that it had on people, you have folks in St. Louis who are saying, what if this could be an actual beginning for a serious truth and reconciliation process? And I'm like, yeah. So I think the stories and the work of the Truth Telling Project, for me, values those folks in Ferguson who stood out there for hundreds of days trying to challenge a system for all of us, not just for Black lives. Because if these folks are challenging military-style policing on American cities, that affects you. And sooner or later, you'll realize that you're living in a police state, if you haven't already. But our stories can have an impact. And what I'm thinking about is Sister Erica Chenoweth at University of Denver, who in her book, Why Civil Disobedience Works, or she writes that 3% of a society, if 3% of a society is engaged in a social movement, then you can shift that entire society. What would that mean for us? And let me tell you how stories are connected. So in the US, obviously it would take 3.5% given our population. And what Erica is doing is she's essentially looking at all of the civil disobedient movements between a certain period, and she's showing how nonviolent protest and civil disobedience, when a large portion, 3%, that's actually not that big, engaged, shifted their actions toward changing society, that society changed. And when I say engaged, how many people know what the definition of militarism is? Or have heard that term? You've heard militarism. But it essentially speaks to how the resources and behavior are focused, right, on the support of war or engaged in some way in tools that contribute to war. Our society is highly militarized. What if we were engaged in the opposite direction in civil disobedience? Now, how does our stories connect to that? So Justin Hansford, who's a law professor and protester at St. Louis University, recounted an instance to me where Mike Brown's mom was in Geneva talking to the Commission on Human Rights. And what he told me was that, Dave, I was in this room and, Mike Brown's mom, she was talking about how her child had laid out on the hot ground in August 2014. She could overhear the police making jokes about her baby. That's when people actually listened. Because people started to connect as a mother, as a brother or a sister, that this could happen to their child. Whereas before she talked, you had lawyers and sociologists and, right, statisticians and folks giving numbers and sharing about the same thing, but the stories are what made the impact. Speaking more broadly, how can progressives create a new narrative grounded in truth and lessons from history? I was at a conference a few weeks ago, and this is what somebody was saying, that, the problem with the progressives is we don't have a coherent narrative or story across the movement. Like, how do we, the reason why we're in this place is because you have to give it to the right wing. They have a story. They have a narrative, albeit a damn lie. They've convinced enough people of it. So, how do we tell a better story that connects to people's lives, that offers hope instead of exclusion? From our perspective, the stories that people told are not just about getting attacked or hurt by police, but the stories are about these damn flies. But the stories are, they essentially, that police violence represents the tip of the iceberg. What's beneath it? Right? The intergenerational humiliation and trauma, the violence, right? The stolen land, destroyed communities, urban renewal. When folks try to do for themselves, people take it. Right? The systematic violence in schools against our kids. Those are what the stories connect to. So our stories have to resituate truth where it should be. So when I talk about truth, I'm not talking about one side says something and then the other side says something. That doesn't acknowledge power. Which is why we don't want to hear from the police. We always hear from the police. And who do people believe? So it is a shift in the way that we can see the world by resituating a perspective that we don't normally care to listen to or hear and understand it as truth. But at the same time, how do we remember how important it is to be led in this moment by those folks who are telling those truths? And aware of white privilege's impact on our movements. You know, for instance, one TRC expert came to Ferguson, and initially I was her, like, gateway, researcher, like I connected her with folks. And to make a long story short, I saw an interview later that she gave, and she was describing her visit as trying to tell us about how truth and reconciliation works, but we didn't understand it. This goes to the core of my concern about activists and academics that write about communities they don't understand. How many people saw that philosophical journal? I think it's Journal of Political Philosophy. There was a special issue on Black Lives Matter, but there was nobody from that movement writing. That's a problem. Or even the term Black Lives Matter. If you call what we're doing the Black Lives Matter movement, that's a problem. It is a movement for Black lives. Because even the way that hashtag came into Ferguson, it erased people's, because the media put it up there. It's now this is your movement. Now I agree that it was an important, term that actually consolidated a lot of our issues, and the ideology is brilliant. But how do we lead our own narratives, and how are activists conscious of what you're saying about other folks' movements? I mean, the truth is, I'm basically coming back from Ferguson in the wake of 3 activists murdered. What would it be like if those activists weren't kind of left by the media moment that comes in and bounces, and these people are still vulnerable? So how do we undermine social movements, even being for good reasons? And I remember talking with the Ford Foundation. Anybody from the Ford Foundation here? It was maybe November or October 2014, and they asked me a question: should we fund truth-telling or Black Lives Matter? I said, that's the wrong question. It should be both of us, and how do we support you all more? But it is that colonizing instinct that comes when these foundations, and some of you, come to our communities and attempt to participate in our struggle. We need you, we want you, but listen. Or one thing that I tell my students, and particularly the undergraduate students, I remember the question, how can I help? And then followed up with, I want to do this. If you go to a community, realize that what you want to do somebody's already doing it from that community. And if you want to help them, ask them what you can do and do it. Not what you want to do. And so, in that spirit, we launched an online learning platform, which we're actually launching very shortly, called It's Time to Listen. And we tried to honor the struggle of folks, their voices and their testimony here. And when this launches, you'll be able to click on it and get lesson plans and organizations doing work that corresponds with the major themes that came out of folks' testimony. Ask yourself, how do we listen and learn from folks' stories? How do we do what is asked of us? How do we learn from them and not impose our own wishes on other folks' struggle? That is the radical edge of activism. Listening and learning and following.